David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 23, I Corroborate Mr. Dick and Choose a Profession. While we were at breakfast, a letter was delivered to me from my aunt. As it contained a matter on which I thought Steerforth could advise me as well as anyone, and on which I knew I should be delighted to consult him, I resolved to make it a subject of discussion on our journey home. For the present, we had enough to do in taking leave of all our friends. "Do you stay here long, Littimer?" said I, as he stood waiting to see the coach start. "No, sir," he replied. "Probably not very long, sir." "He can hardly say just now," observed Steerforth carefully. "He knows what he has to do, and he'll do it." "That I am sure he will," said I. Littimer touched his hat in acknowledgment of my good opinion, and I felt about 8 years old. He touched it once more, wishing us a good journey, and we left him standing on the pavement, as respectable a mystery as any pyramid in Egypt. For some little time we had no conversation. At length Steerforth, becoming gay and talkative in a moment, as he could become anything he liked at any moment, pulled me by the arm. "Find a voice, David. What about the letter you were speaking of at breakfast?" "Oh," said I, taking it out of my pocket. "It's from my aunt." "And what did she say requiring consideration?" "Why, she reminds me, Steerforth," said I, "that I came out on this expedition to look about me, and to think a little." "Which, of course, you have done." "Indeed, I can't say I have, particularly. To tell you the truth, I am afraid I had forgotten it." "Well, look about you now, and make up for your negligence," said Steerforth. "Look to the right, and you'll see a flat country, with a good deal of marsh in it. Look to the left, and you'll see the same. Look to the front, and you'll find no difference. Look to the rear, and there it is still." I laughed and replied that I saw no suitable profession in the whole prospect which was perhaps to be attributed to its flatness. "What says our aunt on the subject?" inquired Steerforth, glancing at the letter in my hand. "Does she suggest anything?" "Why, yes," said I. "She asks me here if I think I should like to be a proctor. What do you think of it?" "Well, I don't know," replied Steerforth coolly. "You may as well do that as anything, I suppose." I could not help laughing again at his balancing all callings and professions so equally, and I told him so. "What is a proctor, Steerforth?" said I. "Why, he is a sort of monkish attorney," replied Steerforth. "He is to some faded corpse held in Doctors' Commons, a lazy old nook near St. Paul's churchyard, what solicitors are to the courts of law and equity. He is a functionary whose existence, in the natural course of things, should have terminated about 200 years ago. I can tell you best what he is by telling you what Doctors' Commons is. It is a little out-of-the-way place, where they administer what is called ecclesiastical law, and play all kinds of tricks with obsolete old monsters, the Acts of Parliament, which 3/4 of the world knows nothing about, and the other fourth supposes to have been dug up in a fossil state in the days of the Edwards. It's a place that has an ancient monopoly in suits about people's wills and people's marriages and disputes among ships and boats. I would recommend you take to Doctors' Commons kindly, David. They plume themselves on all gentility there, I can tell you, if that's any satisfaction." I quite made up my mind to do so. I then told Steerforth that my aunt was in town awaiting me, as I found from her letter, and there she had taken lodgings for a week at a kind of private hotel in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where there was a stone staircase and a convenient door in the roof, my aunt being firmly persuaded that every house in London was going to be burnt down every night. We achieved the rest of our journey pleasantly, sometimes recurring to Doctors' Commons and anticipating the distant days when I should be a proctor there, which Steerforth pictured in a variety of humorous and whimsical lights. That made us both merry. When we came to our journey's end, he went home, and I drove to Lincoln's Inn Fields, where I found my aunt up and waiting supper. If I had been round the world since we parted, we could hardly have been better pleased to meet again. My aunt cried outright as she embraced me, and said, pretending to laugh, that if my poor mother had been alive, that silly little creature would have shed tears, she had no doubt. "So you've left Mr. Dick behind, aunt?" said I. "I am sorry for that." "Ah, Janet, how do you do?" As Janet curtsied, hoping I was well, I observed my aunt's visage lengthened very much. "I am sorry for it too," said my aunt, rubbing her nose. "I have had no peace of mind, Trot, since I have been here." Before I could ask why, she told me. "I am convinced," said my aunt, laying her hand with melancholy firmness on the table, "that Dick's character is not a character to keep the donkeys off. I am confident he wants strength of purpose. I ought to have left Janet at home instead, and then my mind might perhaps have been at ease, if ever there was a donkey trespassing on my green," said my aunt with emphasis. "There was one this afternoon at 4 o'clock. A cold feeling came over me from head to foot, and I know it was a donkey." I tried to comfort her on this point, but she rejected consolation. "It was a donkey," said my aunt, "and it was the one with the stumpy tail, which that murdering sister of a woman rode when she came to my house." This had been, ever since, the only name my aunt knew for Miss Murdstone. Supper was comfortably served and hot. When the table was cleared, Janet assisted her to arrange her hair, to put on her nightcap, which was of a smarter construction than usual, "in case of fire," my aunt said, and to fold her gown back over her knees, these being her usual preparations for warming herself before going to bed. I then made her, according to certain established regulations from which no deviation, however slight, could ever be permitted, a glass of hot white wine and water, and a slice of toast cut into long, thin strips. With these accompaniments, we were left alone to finish the evening, my aunt sitting opposite to me, drinking her wine and water, soaking her strips of toast in it, one by one before eating them, and looking benightedly at me from inside her nightcap. "Well, Trot," she began, "what do you think of the Proctor plan, or have you not begun to think about it?" "I have thought a good deal about it, my dear aunt, and I have talked a good deal about it with Steerforth. I like it very much indeed. I like it exceedingly." "Come," said my aunt, "that's cheering." I have only one difficulty, aunt." "Say what it is, Trot," she returned. "Why, I want to ask, aunt, as it seems, from what I understand, to be a limited profession, whether my entrance into it would not be very expensive." "It will cost," returned my aunt, "to article you, just £1,000. "Now, my dear aunt," I said, drawing my chair nearer, "I am uneasy in my mind about that. It's such a large sum of money. You have expended a great deal on my education, and have always been the soul of generosity. Surely there are some ways in which I might begin life with hardly any outlay, and yet begin with a good hope of getting on by resolution and exertion." My aunt finished eating the piece of toast on which she was then engaged, looking me full in the face all the while, and then, setting her glass on the chimney-piece, and folding her hands upon her folded skirts, replied as follows. "Trot, my child, if I have any object in life, it is to provide for your being a good, a sensible, and a happy man. I have no other claim upon my means, at least." Here, to my surprise, she hesitated, and was confused. "No, I have no other claim upon my means, and you are my adopted child. Only be a loving child to me in my age, and bear with my whims and fancies, and you will do more for an old woman whose prime of life was not so happy or consolating as it might have been, than ever that old woman did for you." It was the first time I had heard my aunt refer to her past history. There was a magnanimity in her quiet way of doing so, and of dismissing it, which would have exalted her in my respect and affection if anything could. "All is agreed and understood between us now, Trot," said my aunt, "and we need talk of this no more. Give me a kiss, and we'll go to the Commons after breakfast tomorrow." At about midday, we set out for the office of Messrs. Spenlow and Jorkins in Doctors' Commons. My aunt, who had this other general opinion in reference to London, that every man she saw was a pickpocket, gave me her purse to carry for her, which had 10 guineas in it and some silver. We made a pause at the toy shop in Fleet Street to see the giants of St. Dunstan's strike upon the bells. We had timed our going so as to catch them at it, at 12 o'clock, and then went on toward Ludgate Hill and St. Paul's Churchyard. We were crossing to the former place when I found that my aunt greatly accelerated her speed and looked frightened. I observed at the same time that a lowering, ill-dressed man, who had stopped and stared at us in passing a little before, was coming so close after us as to brush against her. "Trot, my dear Trot!" cried my aunt in a terrified whisper and pressing my arm. "I don't know what I am to do." "Don't be alarmed," said I. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Step into a shop, and I'll soon get rid of the fellow." "No, no, my child," she returned. "Don't speak to him for all the world. I entreat, I order you." "Good heavens, aunt," said I. "He is nothing but a sturdy beggar." "You don't know what he is," replied my aunt. "You don't know who he is. You don't know what you say." We had stopped at an empty doorway while this was passing, and he stopped too. "Don't look at him," said my aunt, as I turned my head indulgently. "But get me a coach, my dear, and wait for me in St. Paul's Churchyard." "Wait for you?" I replied. "Yes," rejoined my aunt. "I must go alone. I must go with him." "With him, aunt? This man?" "I am in my senses," she replied, "and I tell you I must. Get me a coach." However much astonished I might be, I was sensible that I had no right to refuse compliance with such a peremptory command. I hurried away a few paces and called a hackney chariot, which was passing empty. Almost before I could let down the steps, my aunt sprang in. I don't know how, and the man followed. She waved her hand to me to go away so earnestly that all confounded as I was, I turned from them at once. In so doing, I heard her say to the coachman, "Drive anywhere, drive straight on," and presently the chariot passed me going up the hill. What Mr. Dick had told me, and what I had supposed to be a delusion of his, now came into my mind. I could not doubt that this person was the person of whom he had made such mysterious mention. Though what the nature of his hold upon my aunt could possibly be, I was quite unable to imagine. After half an hour's cooling in the churchyard, I saw the chariot coming back. The driver stopped beside me, and my aunt was sitting in it alone. She had not yet sufficiently recovered from her agitation to be quite prepared for the visit we had to make. She desired me to get into the chariot, and to tell the coachman to drive slowly up and down a little while. She said no more except, "My dear child, never ask me what it was, and don't refer to it," until she had perfectly regained her composure, when she told me that she was quite herself now, and we might get out. On her giving me her purse to pay the driver, I found that all the guineas were gone. Doctors' Commons was approached by a little low archway. Before we had taken many paces down the street beyond it, the noise of the city seemed to melt, as if by magic, into a softened distance. A few dull courts and narrow ways brought us to the skylightened offices of Spenlow and Jorkins, in the vestibule of which temple, accessible to pilgrims, without the ceremony of knocking, 3 or 4 clerks were at work as copyists. One of these, a little dry man, sitting by himself, who wore a stiff brown wig that looked as if it were made of gingerbread, rose to receive my aunt and show us into Mr. Spenlow's rooms. And we will pause there.